Curtis Grodin met with his cowhands at 6 in the morning, as usual, in the bunkhouse. He told Joe Gandy, "I need you to ride south Chilcoot Canyon and round up some strays that the Shelleys told me my cousin Jack about. They ran into each other at the gas station in Kim. There might be as many as 10 head down there, 'cause I found a big hole in the fence when I drove down there. There might even be more, I don't know. Sure were a lot of hoof prints crossing there. This might take you a couple of days." "Sure, Curtis. You know I'll get them back in," Joe replied. Joe put on his ragged denim jacket and dilapidated cowboy hat and walked out to the tack shed. He gathered up his bridle, reins, and saddle and carried them through the splinters of sunlight just breaking over the flat eastern horizon to the horse corral. He bridled and saddled Banjo, one of the strongest and spirited of the ranch's horses. "Time for a long ride, Banjo." He spoke quietly to the sorrel. He led Banjo out of the corral and tied him up outside the bunkhouse. He went inside and gathered biscuits, longhorn cheese, beef jerky, and 2 small apples in a canvas bag. He grabbed his lever-action rifle in its saddle scabbard and walked out to Banjo. He attached the rifle to the saddle and stuffed the bag into the saddlebag tied to the back of the saddle. Then he mounted in 2 smooth movements. He never wore spurs, never used a quirt or whip, and usually did not even wear gloves. These things were standard equipment for the other cowboys. Joe had never seen the point. When anyone teased him about his lack of equipment, Joe would quietly retort, "Horses are gentle animals. They are easier to manage for longer periods of time with soft words and a sweet treat now and again." Other cowboys would laugh at him and shake their heads in disagreement. He never argued about it. He rode southwest from the ranch, riding towards the mouth of Chilcoot Canyon 4 miles away. An hour later he arrived at the arroyo that began its boulder-strewn descent into Chilcoot Canyon. He stood up in the stirrups and slowly surveyed all around. Just above the horizon, directly south, he spotted a tiny, dark dot. The dot moved slowly a few times. "Well, I guess that could be one of our cows. Sure did wander far, if so. Wasn't expecting any this far south," he thought to himself. Joe patted the horse on the neck and said, "Get over there, Banjo. That's probably one of ours." He kicked into the horse's flanks and braced himself as Banjo sprinted into a full lope for the dot, miles away in the distance. He found 4 cows and a calf grazing not far from the gravel highway that connected Kim to Trinidad, Colorado. They were at least 10 miles south of the ranch land from where they were supposed to be. It was a long day of tedious riding to get the cattle to move back up north, and then through the hole in the fence. He got the cattle there. He was sweaty and tired. Banjo stumbled and stank of sweat that lathered up white around his mouth and sides. Joe dismounted and carefully led Banjo through the hole in the barbed wire. Close proximity to barbed wire always caused Banjo to get skittish, even more so in his tired state. Joe tied his reins to a juniper tree and patted him on the neck. "You take a break. You've earned it today," he murmured to Banjo. Then he pulled his little fence-fixing kit out of the saddlebag and walked back to repair the hole in the barbed wire fence. He came back to Banjo in about an hour and pulled one of the apples out of the canvas bag and ate about half of it. He held the remaining half on his flat, outstretched hand and fed it to Banjo. As he untied the reins and started leading the horse deeper into the canyon, he said, "Well, Banjo, we're both too tired to ride back to the ranch. But hey, old Zino's place is only about a couple of miles away. There's hay there and clear water. Haven't seen that old Mexican in a long time. We could buck down there for the night. What do you say?" The horse only eyed him tiredly and snuffled a little bit. "Well, okay then, old Zino's it is." Then he kept walking, keeping the load off of the tired horse that he regarded as a friend. As Joe thought about his old Mexican friend, he remembered the full story Zino had told him of his life there. Chapter 3. Zino the Fugitive. When Zino first arrived on horseback to the high plains of southeastern Colorado in the spring of 1892, The place had only recently been declared a state in the United States of America, some 15 years earlier. The Colorado Territory was still a wild country when it became a state in 1876, recently upbraided by the oppressive Colorado War. Self-righteous white settlers and armed militias joined U.S. government forces to annihilate, with extreme prejudice, the Cheyenne, Comanche, and Arapaho native tribes. They murdered native men, women, and children, declaring that the only good Injun is a dead Injun. Zino was 24 years old when he fled his homestead. He finally stopped staring back over his shoulder after arriving in Colorado. Nobody seemed to be pursuing him. Still, he was sure the white rancher and his friends were certainly trying to find him, to lynch him, and kill him with the only due process they ever seemed to use for non-white citizens. Zino arrived in Picket Wire Canyon as the sun was setting. Both he and his horse were completely exhausted after days of trailing north. He was very hungry, and his saddlebags only some hog fat, cornmeal, and salt left to eat. It was late springtime, so the nights never dropped below freezing. The high, thin breeze still bit into his face and caused him to feel some regret for running north. This was an austere, sandy, rocky land, its only attraction to him being its forsakenness. He saw it as a place he could hide for only a little time, while he made further plans. When he came to a muddy pool in a tiny river in the middle of the branching in the canyon, he slid slowly off his horse and led him to the water. His horse drank deeply as Zino lay down on a flat stretch of sandstone and cupped water into his mouth with his hands. It was a quiet place. He saw a stand of piñon trees on a little hill nearby. He hobbled his horse, removed his saddlebags, saddle and bridle, and let the horse wander around to rest and graze. He hauled everything into the thicket at the center of the whorl, created by a stand of gnarled 12-foot-tall evergreen piñons. He welcomed the strong, sweet smell of the trees. He laid the saddle down as his pillow and spread out the wool blanket from his saddle as his bed. He wearily dropped down and rested his head on the grounded saddle. He thought to himself how wonderfully sweet the piney trees smelled as he dropped off to sleep within seconds. He slept like the dead for 12 hours. He awoke the next morning, stiff, hungry, and yet at least somewhat rested. After stepping out of the hollow in the trees, he found his horse, grazing, only 100 yards away. He decided to leave the saddle and other tack in the trees and wandered around with one of his pistols in his belt holster, at the ready. The sun was coming up, and he heard very little sound, except for a breeze that started picking up, whispering through the few trees. His exhaustion was abated, and yet he still felt tired to his bones and hungry. He felt no hope, had no plan, and wondered to himself how it would be possible to go on. He sat down at the edge of the muddy pool, pulled off his leather boots, and dangled his feet in the water. No plan came to mind, just gnawing pain in his stomach. He tried to ignore his hunger as he attempted to think of anything he could put together for a plan. His thoughts were jumbled and darkly menacing. Hunger, he finally decided, was the first and foremost problem. He put his boots back on and walked back into the trees to retrieve his saddlebags. Since he still worried some about the men he felt sure were pursuing him, he decided to make a very small fire in the center of the little clearing formed by the copse of trees. He used one of the few matches he still had to light a wad of lichen moss under a bunch of piñon sticks. When the coals from the fire were hot, he placed the small cast-iron skillet on them, which he kept tucked into one saddlebag. He had poured a little water in and mixed in a handful of cornmeal, forming a simple tortilla. He had not formed it right, though, just mixed it in the pan with a little pat of rancid hog fat to form more of a crumbly porridge than a proper tortilla. He ate it quickly in clumps from his hunting knife. When it was gone, he considered making more. He eyed the small canvas bag of cornmeal again and hefted it in his hand. It seemed like there might be about 5 more tortillas worth. Wearily, he chose to put everything away and be happy that his stomach was no longer completely empty. Thoughts of how to feed himself beyond a couple more days flooded his mind. He stepped back out of the trees and froze in mid-step. Not more than 10 yards away, near the edge of the small creek that had a river's name, Zino spotted a cottontail rabbit. His heart soared with hope for meat to eat. Very slowly, he pulled out his revolver and took careful aim. The first shot missed, but as the small rabbit darted away, Zino desperately tracked it and shot again, killing it with a bullet through its neck. He quickly dressed out the small furry animal and hung it on a broken branch of a pinyon tree while he built up the fire. He cut the meat off the bone and dropped it into his pan with a tiny square of hog fat. He ate the whole rabbit happily and sat back against his saddle, licking his fingers clean. Hope reared a tenuous head. The rabbit meal started him to thinking about not making any further plans than simply to plan on surviving in that lonely place, where he doubted anyone seeking him would ever venture to look. Every day, Zino carefully explored the branches of the box canyons, keeping a weather eye out for animals and men. He saw only wild animals for 8 days, until he inched up to the edge of the high rim rock he had climbed up to one morning and saw a lone cowboy slowly making his way by horseback through the bottomlands. Zino drew back and hid himself amongst some of the scrub juniper. He watched for a long while until the man was far out of sight, and then returned to his makeshift camp a couple of miles back down the canyon. He determined in his mind that he would never be discovered. So he kept to cover, used a very small cooking fire, and only early in the morning, and again near sundown, and made as little noise as possible. As summer bloomed, Zino had made a small lean-to against one tree out of pinyon branches he cut. He kept his tack and few belongings underneath. He had limited ammunition for his pistols and wanted to stay as quiet as possible, so he carved himself a crude bow and fashioned 2 arrows out of pinyon branches. He discovered quite a few artifacts that really helped. Ancient, native-made flint arrowheads he found in his explorations, so he tied 2 of them to his crude arrows. One day he was rewarded by being able to bring down a larger animal than a rabbit with his bow and arrow. He had the good fortune to slip up on a watering white-tailed deer doe while she was drinking water at the small pool. That night he risked a slightly bigger fire and roasted all the venison over it. He ate the much-needed meat for a few days, regaining his failed strength. A new problem developed after living this way for a few months. The silent loneliness began taking a toll. He found himself muttering to himself and sometimes caught himself trying to answer his own questions. He dared not reveal himself to anyone, and yet he became interested in learning of any people that might be living somewhere nearby. He started exploring the high plains outside the canyons. Zino was exploring the southeastern limits of Chilcoot Canyon, climbing up out of the shallow arroyo where the end of the canyon petered out. He gazed out to the horizon over the flat waves of grama grass. The near-desert plainness was put in perspective by small forests of cholla cactus, with their half-foot-long branching hot-dog segments covered in sharp inch-long spines. As he watched, he was surprised by the bright white bonnet of a covered wagon advancing over the grass towards him. He led his horse back down the arroyo and hobbled him in a thicket of juniper trees. Then he crept back up to watch from all 4s under the brush while the wagon arrived about 200 yards away, pulled by 2 tired horses lathered with sweat in their traces. A young man and his wife sat on the front bench, looking equally tired. As the 2 unhitched the horses and set about making a camp, Zino wondered what could have possibly brought the young couple out to such a god-forsaken place as this. Thus began his daily spy on a white homesteader, there to build his own small ranch with his wife at his side. Over the first few days of spying on them, he came to understand that they were named Droke. The man James, the woman was Edwina. Their newly permanent presence irked and titillated him at the same time. One day, Zino had an intense conversation with himself after bagging a large deer buck. He knew half the meat would go to waste, and he knew the young couple was short on food. Finally, his need for society won out over his fear. He threw half the venison over his shoulder, rode up to the edge of the arroyo, hobbled his horse, and started hauling it on his back towards the Drokes' camp. James Droke saw Zino waving as he walked up to him, with half a deer draped over his back. "Hola! Hola, amigos!" Zino yelled. He lifted the carcass off his back and stretched it out with both arms to James. Lifting it out of Zino's arms, James said, "What's this? You got some venison you can't keep from going bad?" Zino shrugged his arms and replied, "Un poco de carne para usted y su esposa." James shook his head and spoke over his shoulder in English. "Sorry, mister, I can't rightly understand your Mexican words, but hey, I'll gladly trade you some things we can spare for this meat." The first work Zino did for another, while living as a fugitive in Colorado, was for James Droke. They were about the same age, but other than that, they could not have been more different. James knew no Spanish, had been raised in a well-to-do family in Arkansas, and looked down on Zino with a racist prejudice. James knew nothing about the rigors of survival on the high plains. Fortunately, his wife Edwina did speak a little of Zino's language. It was she who thanked Zino for the gift of the venison. In return, she gave Zino some cornmeal, pork lard, and a few feet of thin hemp rope. Because they tolerated him and bartered with him, Zino returned to their growing homestead about once a week. Through Edwina, he informed James that he would help him build a cabin if he would let him assist. At first, James scoffed at the offer, telling his wife, "Tell that dumb Mexican we don't need no help. I'll build us a place by myself. He would just be in the way." What Edwina told Zino in her broken Spanish was to wait and see if James might need help, and thanked him for his kind offer. 2 weeks later, as James labored without skill trying to construct a cabin out of freshly cut green pinon trees and twisted juniper, it was clear to Zino that the man had no idea how to build a warm cabin with the materials at hand. As James unhitched one of the horses from a freshly cut log, Zino quietly spoke to Edwina on the side, again offering to help them build a cabin. Edwina told Zino in her limited Spanish, "No te pago. Pagamos comida. Hilo. Curia. ¿Está bien?" Basically, "We can't pay you except in food, thread, and leather. Is that okay with you?" in English. "It is nothing. You have been kind to me, and maybe some mañana you will be able to help me in some way. Let me help." She understood most of Zino's reply to mean. It took Edwina only a few more days to soften up her husband, to get him to agree, at least to the idea of trying to work with Zino to build a cabin. She offered to translate while they worked. James looked down at his blistered hands and grouchily agreed to give it one try. When Zino arrived a day later, James pointed to the foundation square he had dug into the prairie and the pile of logs beside it. Zino quickly went to work and pantomimed to James to help him set the log and use an axe to carve notches at each end. Once he had a square of hewn logs outlining the foundation, he took a bucket to the little creek that fed into the arroyo and filled it with mud. Edwina translated his instructions to James, and the two men spread the mud on top of the log square. They repeated the process layer by layer until the log stood as a wall 6 feet high, with one section open for a doorway and a small window square. The roof was fashioned from smaller poles glued with mud and covered over with a few inches of earth to form a growing sod covering. Thus, with Zino's help, a solid, secure, and warm cabin was erected in just a few days. James began to appreciate Zino and even learned a few Spanish phrases. When he had acquired several sheep for his growing ranch, which he called Droke's Place, he hired Zino to help him tend the sheep. He paid in food, sundries, and leather goods. Hope grew in Zino's heart, and he also grew to love the young couple. They offered to help him build a small cabin nearby, but he always left them and returned to his own place in the canyon, slowly building up his nearly hidden lean-to against a giant boulder in one boxed-in canyon branch. not a half mile from his original camp in the trees. The Drokes was a minimal cabin of only about 150 square feet in area. They planned to use it as the homestead base, while they built a much larger sod-roofed log cabin for the family they were planning. Zino became their one hired hand, which helped him make firmer, longer-range plans. He saved the little money they ever paid him for the purchase of his first sheep. When he was not working for the Drokes, Zino shadowed the other early settlers, not always deciding to reveal himself to them. He avoided any social invitations and hid himself any time he felt threatened by the presence of a stranger. It was not the life he had started with in New Mexico, but it was a life that he committed to and kept him grounded in the high country. He did not feel exactly at home, but he felt relatively safe. He went on to live in the canyon for the rest of his life.